Welcome back. At the start of the pandemic, many believed children faced very mild symptoms of COVID 19. While that belief still remains prevalent, a study conducted by researchers at Montefiore and Einstein highlights that children with obesity and diabetes may actually face higher risks of being hospitalized. Joining me for a discussion on this is study author Dr. Jerry Chow. Doctor, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Very happy to be here.
So, as part of the Montefiore and Einstein health system, you led a study looking closely at how COVID affects children with pre existing conditions. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. Early on in the pandemic, we studied some of the first children who were getting sick from COVID. As our experience grew, we wanted to study more of the children who were testing positive for COVID and how many of them required hospitalization. We wanted to see if risk factors, such as obesity or a past medical history of asthma, were different in the children who required hospitalization in order to try to figure out which children seemed to get sicker.
Now, one of the factors her team looked at, as you mentioned, is diabetes. According to the CDC, type 1 diabetes is most often diagnosed in children, teens, and young adults, and now more kids are developing type 2 diabetes. Can you tell those who don't know the difference between the two types of diabetes? Can you tell us what the difference is?
Mhm. In type 1 diabetes, the body cannot produce insulin, which is the hormone that helps sugar enter the cells to produce energy. As a result, sugar builds up in the bloodstream and damages the body. It's thought to occur because the body attacks itself by mistake, destroying its own cells in the pancreas. This can be caused by genetic reasons or environmental triggers such as viruses. Diet, or the food we tend to eat, and lifestyle habits don't cause type 1 diabetes. On the other hand, in type 2 diabetes, insulin is still produced by the pancreas. The cells in the body do not respond normally to it. It's called insulin resistance. More and more children are developing type 2 diabetes. This may be due to certain habits related to diet, again, the type of food that people tend to eat, as well as limited physical activity. In order to study this, we analyzed children from March to October in 2020 of the coronavirus pandemic, and we looked at 319 children overall. Of those, 87, or about 27%, were hospitalized. Six children in the study had a history of diabetes, all of them type 2 diabetes, and all of them were hospitalized. This suggests that a past medical history of diabetes is associated with increased need for hospitalization.
Now, you mentioned another factor was obesity. According to several reports, obesity and diabetes have both increased in children amid the pandemic. Can you explain some reasons why we may have seen such a huge change in a short period of time?
There is thinking that decreased outdoor activity during the pandemic, combined with staying at home, may have contributed to more obesity and diabetes in children. Also, children who are already developing obesity and diabetes, this process, it may have been accelerated because of the pandemic. This underscores the importance of continued health maintenance and prevention now more than ever, especially during the winter holiday season with Christmas and New Year's celebrations approaching. Children and people of all ages should be encouraged to receive their COVID vaccination and boosters if eligible, and use protective measures like masking and social distancing.
Now, besides being hospitalized, how else did children with pre-existing conditions differ from those who didn't have them?
In general, the children who needed hospitalization tended to present with more severe symptoms. So, for example, they had fevers, they had developed shortness of breath, fatigue, as well as nausea and vomiting, just to name some examples.
In this study, you also assessed whether asthma and socioeconomic status affected this. Your research found that it did not, but can you explain why it was important to also look at those characteristics as a factor?
It was important to look at those characteristics because it makes sense why they might play a role, and research in general should explore these and all different types of possibilities because sometimes we find results that are not what we expect.
So I could definitely agree to that. I was very surprised to see that asthma and low socioeconomic status had little to no effect on hospitalization rates. Because just based on what we know, that's usually not the case. Do you know why that may be?
We were also surprised. We think it's because the population in the Bronx that we studied is in general of a similar socioeconomic status. So it was difficult to demonstrate differences between the groups because of this similarity. However, we all have clearly seen that COVID disproportionately affects and harms people who are impoverished and people of color. With regard to asthma, our study reinforces other study findings that have shown that children with asthma are not at increased risk for worse illness due to COVID.
Now, I think this study was really interesting because in the beginning of the pandemic, as I mentioned previously, it was believed that kids were not as affected by the virus. And I think some people thought that children couldn't even get it. Can you tell us why that was commonly believed?
Yeah. In the beginning of the pandemic, we were seeing a surge in mostly adults getting sick. We think this may be due to differences in the biology between adults and kids. But as you said, as more and more adults got sicker, they began to expose children more and more to the coronavirus. And as a result, we saw that children could also develop illness as well.
Now, following the study, findings suggest the importance of targeted and proactive outreach to children with obesity and diabetes. What does that look like for families with children within these categories?
We encourage all eligible children to receive their COVID vaccine. People should also continue to wear masks and socially distance, especially in indoors and tightly packed spaces and areas where the health and vaccination status of the people around your children are unknown. As with every important healthcare decision, families of children with obesity and diabetes should consult with their trusted pediatricians and healthcare providers to tailor decisions based on the specific health and needs of their individual child. This should be an ongoing discussion to help families become more comfortable with their decision making.
Now, I really want to know a little bit. We talked about diabetes earlier. How does diabetes actually affect children different from adults?
Yeah. So type 1 diabetes, it tends to come on earlier in life. And so specifically, as I go back to my responses for that, it used to be called insulin dependent or juvenile diabetes and is usually diagnosed in children, teens, and young adults, but it can develop at any age. Type 2 diabetes most often develops in people over the age of 45, but more and more children, as said, teenagers and young adults are also developing it. The effects are generally the same between younger patients and adults, in which blood sugar levels need to be checked often and medications need to be administered to help with the control of blood sugar. However, children and young adults are still growing and developing both physically and emotionally, so they require special considerations and support. I think what's also important to note is that type 2 diabetes can be improved with lifestyle modifications like changes in diet and exercise. So there's an opportunity there to improve one's health with changes.
Thank you. Now, although vaccines have been out and are now recommended for children 5 and up, many parents are still cautious. Can you explain why it's still safer to maybe go with the vaccine despite these health conditions?
The decision for parents and caretakers to vaccinate their eligible children, it's a deeply personal one that depends on a lot of different things. And since the vaccine is so new, parents may understandably have questions about the vaccine. Overall, the vaccine appears to be very safe based on the clinical trial data. We encourage parents and caretakers to have individualized conversations about their child with their trusted pediatricians and healthcare providers to aid in their decision making.
So, where can people go to learn more information about where to get their children vaccinated in the Bronx?
Please visit covid19.montefiore.org to schedule an appointment at Montefiore to get your children vaccinated. You can also look at vaccinefinder.nyc.gov.
And can you tell us how people can actually stay up to date with you and Montefiore and everyone involved with the study?
Definitely. Please visit us on our website as well as on our social media and Twitter resources that you see there below.
All right, Doctor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll be right back with more Open BXRX Tuesday.